Stephanie, you're very outspoken on deficit politics and the ways in which people talk about deficits in Washington and the ways they get that wrong in your view.
Hi, this is Stephanie Kelton, and you're listening to Left Out.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Left Out. My name's Mike Palmieri, back at you with another new episode. My colleagues Paul Sliker and Dante Del Valle aren't here for this introduction, but they are with me during our conversation with Professor Kelton when we went to interview her at Stony Brook in Long Island. Stephanie Kelton is a leading American economist and currently a professor of public policy and economics at Stony Brook University. She used to be a chief economist on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee and was an economic advisor to the Bernie 2016 presidential campaign. Professor Kelton is most known for being a pioneer of modern monetary theory. In this episode, she debunks some budget deficit and government spending myths and explains how getting a grip on our monetary system and how it works can help us make the case economically and politically for important programs like universal health care, free public higher education, and investing in infrastructure. We also explore some current economic issues, including how we might be able to cancel student debt. Actually, if you look in the show description for this episode, we'll post a link to that report released through the Levy Institute. And lastly, she touches on the role and challenges of women in economics. Just a quick reminder before we jump in, please follow us on our brand new Twitter account at Left Out Podcast. And also, please consider becoming a supporter and make a small donation to our Patreon. A little goes a long way for covering the overhead costs and allows us to travel a few hours to meet with some of our guests, as we did in this episode, in person. All right, let's jump into our conversation with Professor Stephanie Kelton. So, Professor Kelton, thanks for joining Left Out.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to do it.
Yeah, great for you to be here. Maybe we could begin first by just explaining who you are and how your interest in economics began in the first place.
Oh my. My interest in economics is by accident, really. I think I had 7 different majors when I was in college. If I recall correctly, I started off thinking I was going to be a dentist. So I took a lot of science classes and the sort of pre-med track, and then all of a sudden I decided this wasn't for me because I discovered that you have to work on cadavers, and that sort of put me off. And so then I started studying law, and then eventually fall into business because that's what students who are floundering do. They say, I'm going to do a degree in business. So I started doing a business degree and took some accounting and thought maybe I would track into accounting. And that's where they require you to take some econ. So I took my first economics course, and I had a professor by the name of John Henry who went on to become a colleague of mine. This is a different story. But anyway, he changed my life, essentially. I mean, it wasn't so much that I liked the course that he taught because it was microeconomics, and that's awful.
Yeah, a bit dry,
yeah,
to say the least.
But I really loved him, and it was the second class I took with him, which was the history of economic thought, that really captured my attention.
Just so important. It's you don't see that as much anymore.
Yeah, it forced me to wrestle with questions that I'd never thought about before. I mean, I thought maybe I was going to study finance and I was going to make a lot of money and, be my own boss or this sort of, thing. I don't know. You're young and you think about these things differently. Right. And then when I did the history of economic thought course, and started thinking about capitalism more deeply. And I mean, this is the first time that it ever occurred to me that not everyone can be a capitalist. And that was just jarring, because I was like, oh, a capitalist hires workers, so somebody has to be the workers, And so anyway, I started eating this stuff up and reading a lot of work that really interested me, crazy stuff like, Veblen's theory of the leisure class and this kind of stuff. And then there was just no turning back.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the history of economic thought is kind of making a revival these days in a certain way.
Especially in the program that I'm at.
That's right.
John
John
Jay.
See, it's still really rare, though. Finding an
it's still
economics
rare, yeah.
department that offers the history of economic thought is rare.
I should have
And
prefaced that.
It's
Yeah, I should have
wild.
prefaced that.
It's one of the courses that they begin to shove out first when they're trying to kind of cleanse a department and make it, quote, safe and rigorous.
Yeah, rigorous. That's
yeah,
a great
because
word that's
look what
used.
happened to me, right? You
Right.
study the history of economic thought and you start asking all kinds of dangerous
Sure.
things.
Yeah.
So it is increasingly, it's nice if it is making a comeback.
I think it's a testament to that most of the students in my program are not econ undergrads. They're all from anthropology or history or sociology, and they got interested in economics because they wanted to ask these questions that aren't being asked in the profession.
Yeah.
So I think that's definitely a new phenomenon that we're seeing. And it's encouraging too, especially in a time where a lot of people are discouraged by the political, environment that we're in. I think that kids are starting to really question what's going on, and the left is seeing that understanding economics is so important for if you want to really get involved in radical change.
Yeah.
I should have. It's making a revival from outside the academic economic departments. But so you're probably most known in the economic field for your contributions to what is called modern monetary theory. For those people who have a bit of understanding of what MMT is, they'll know that one of its basic foundations, or a good starting point for sort of talking about it, is through understanding the role of sovereign currencies, like we have here in the US and Canada, in the UK, Australia, essentially governments that are issuers of their own currency, meaning they have a monopoly on the creation of their currency. But would you give our listeners a brief overview of what modern monetary theory is, maybe starting through that lens, comparing it to what the mainstream perspective is, and how MMT differs from it?
Sure. Well, let's start with the mainstream perspective, or even just the conventional narrative, right? When you hear people talk about the federal government's budget, usually it involves some discussion of something that's gone wrong, right? Something that needs to be fixed. The budget is in deficit, and people immediately think that that's not where it needs to be, because that's what policymakers and pundits and everything you read, everything you're confronted or bombarded with in your daily life has to do, when you hear about the budget, is, fixing it, that something's wrong. And then to the extent that somebody tries to explain why, they usually just go for a simple kind of analogy, because it's easy for people to understand. So where do they go? They go to the household and they say, look, the federal government is spending more than it takes in. This is not sustainable. You and I know, right? Go right for personal finances, because the finances we're most familiar with are our own. And so they try to liken their situation to what would happen to us if we behaved the same way. Right. So they say, what would happen to you if you went on, year after year, spending more than you take in, you never saved anything, you just took on debt and piled on debt, you'd go broke, right? So they say, that's exactly what will happen to the government if we don't get the fiscal house in order. And notice the language that they use, right? They poll test all of this is by design. Every word is really carefully chosen. So when they say the fiscal house in order, it's just another way to reinforce that idea that it's like a household. And if we don't get our fiscal house in order, bad things are going to happen. So what are the bad things? Then they go for your heart. They say, it's the grandchildren. We're passing on all of this debt to future generations. So now they've made you scared and sad. And they say, if we don't do anything, we're going to end up like Greece. So Greece becomes the poster child for where America is headed if it doesn't begin to make, as even President Obama said, tough choices, shared sacrifice, tightening the belt, all of those kinds of phrases. But at the end of the day, it's designed to make the rest of us believe that the government's debt is our debt. We're inheriting the debt, and then we're passing it on to the next generation. They're going to be worse off. They're going to be poorer. They're going to face higher taxes in the future. They're going to have shoddier lives. And it's really tragic, because it's a way of creating a narrative that makes the public not only accepting of austerity, but almost like give it to us, give it to us, give it to us, like
sort of
welcoming.
Orwellian, too.
Say,
It's-
please
make
help us,
me
help.
hurt today so that I don't have to hurt my kids tomorrow, you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
So starting from that framework, I guess, could you give a brief history of MMT? Like, for instance, who are some of the foundational economists that you can attribute to the formation of MMT, and maybe just some economists that influenced you personally into this kind of philosophy?
Sure. So I will admit that until somewhere in the late 1990s, I didn't think of things any differently than what I just described to you, because that's all I had ever been taught. Even in my economics program, the government has a budget constraint, and it's all formal and mathematized, but you can see it right there. You know, it's in the textbooks, and so you're taught that there is only so far that the government can push things when it's running budget deficits. And I thought, okay, well, that's true. Right?
And then you
That's
get the
way it works.
reinforcement in the press and
Right.
politicians are saying it.
Right.
Yeah.
So somewhere in the late 1980s, I've just left Cambridge University on a fellowship to go spend some time at the Levy Economics Institute, which is here in
Which
New
is a
York.
great place. I think Professor Wolf has presented there as well. They're doing some really good work.
Yeah,
up
they,
there.
they do tremendous things.
Yeah.
They hold a big important conference every April in the name of Hyman Minsky. So then they do a summer school where they train students from all over the world, a Minsky summer school. They do lots of good policy oriented work up there. So I got this fellowship through Christ College in Cambridge, and I at Cambridge University. I came to the Levy Institute. Randy Ray was there. I had met Randy, I think, once before. That is not true. I had worked for, I had known Randy for a while. Geez, it's been a long time, guys. I spent time
That's
at the
fine.
University of
Interesting.
Denver. So I had known Randy because before going off to Cambridge,
interesting.
I spent the equivalent of two quarters there on the quarter system at DU. And I took a bunch of courses. I didn't pay any tuition, so I didn't get any credit. But they graded all of my assignments and treated me just like a regular student. I was just sort of, it was a dress rehearsal for grad school, I guess, before going off to Cambridge. So I did get to know Randy there. And then I ended up with the fellowship to the Levy Institute. Randy's there, Wayne Godley is there. Minsky had passed away,
Right.
but you know he's still sort of there. And Matt Forstatter was there, and this is where Randy was working on his book, Understanding Modern Money, which was one of the first attempts to lay out, in a popular sort of way, you know, a short, kind of readable book, the principal tenets of MMT. And Randy was working on that book, and the inspiration really was a guy by the name of Warren Mosler, who we all ended up being hugely influenced by. And what's interesting is this is not an economist by training. I mean, he has an undergrad degree in economics, but he made his career as a guy who operates in financial markets, and he really understood things and he saw things differently. I think because he hadn't been trained in economics, so he didn't
More of an
carry.
empirical kind of how do things
He
actually
was
play out.
exactly.
Yeah.
He's watching the world around him. He's watching traders. He's thinking about markets in a different way, and he didn't have the intellectual baggage that had been foisted on him
Right.
through years of graduate training, and he didn't need to be reprogrammed. He just came in with a fresh look. And the first time we read a little pamphlet, it was a little thing that Warren had written. He called it Soft Currency Economics. And it's really where you started with our conversation about, governments being the issuer of their own currency. And Warren's point was it's a, quote, soft currency, not a hard currency. It's not a gold standard anymore.
Right.
So we have this thing called fiat money. It's not tethered to anything that's physical or finite. It's a floating currency. And the policy space that's available to countries that have this type of monetary arrangement is just fundamentally different from actors that don't have that, like Greece or the state of Kansas or you and I or whatever, right? So Warren's putting out these arguments in the form of this little pamphlet, and we all end up reading it. And it's just, first you resist it because this can't be right. It's just simple almost,
Right.
Somebody would have noticed this before if this was correct. So you start pushing back a little bit. Then you start revisiting the literature, and you find that it's in Keynes and it's in the work of Abel Lerner, and you just start reading Adam Smith, and all of a sudden you start persuading yourself that you have made a huge mistake in the way that you've been thinking about really big questions in economics. And so those are some of the early influences.
So you touched on this before. Most people are so consumed by the idea that what's good for the individual in terms of finances is also good for the economy, for the government as a whole. For example, common thing is that people think that we need to balance the government budget like we would balance a household budget, as you mentioned earlier. Why is this type of logic just essentially wrong?
Well, it's wrong because I sometimes just put it as simply as I can think to put it, which is capitalism runs on sales, right? Without sales, there can be no customers in the businesses in the economy. Without customers, there can be no revenue, and without revenue, there can be no profit. And capitalism is a profit-seeking enterprise. So you got to have this engine of growth thing happening, which requires profits to happen. So imagine that you're paying your workers, they get an income, and they have to decide what they're going to do with the income. A portion of it is gone right away because of taxes. So some of the dollars that have been paid out to workers, they can't return to businesses buying goods and services because it's drained out because you're paying taxes. Then suppose you decide you're going to set something aside. Maybe you have the luxury of making enough money that you can actually save. Mm-hmm. Millions of Americans don't have that, but a lot of them do. And every dollar that you decide to save instead of spend is a dollar that can't be captured by some business, can't become part of their sales, their revenue, and their profits. So that's another, we call them leakages, right? It's a demand leakage. Mm-hmm. And then every time you buy something that's produced somewhere else in the world, not here, domestically, that dollar leaks out of economists call it the circular flow. So you got all these leakages happening. The problem is, if you don't do anything about those leakages, then businesses watch the customers disappearing. Their inventories rise. They don't have the demand to keep producing at the same level. So what do? You say, I guess I produced too much. I need to scale back. So they fire some workers, they produce less, they let old machines wear out and they don't replace them, and the economy contracts and languishes and stagnates. So what you have to have is some form of injection on the other side, some replacement for the taxes that are drained away and the savings that's drained away and the imports. So where can those come from? Well, the rest of the world can buy some stuff from us, but right now that's not happening, right? We buy more from the rest of the world than they buy from us. So we have a net drain there. Businesses can invest, and investment spending will replace some of that lost demand. But why would businesses invest if they don't see the customers, because customers are saving? So who does that leave? It leaves the government, right? You're the last great hope to put some demand into the economy, to keep the economic activity at a level high enough to keep people employed and keep the economy growing. So that's a long answer to a kind of a short question, but that's it. You can't behave. They tell households all the time, just save, right? Yeah. Save.
I mean, if you could, it's again an old idea, but so important. The paradox of thrift. I mean, if you want to explain that, it's pretty much what you just stated, but what's interesting, if everyone was to save, what would happen?
That's exactly right. It is what I stated, but I didn't call it, I didn't give it the wonky wording, but that's a Keynesian kind of a description, right? What is the paradox of thrift? Well, it's a paradox, Keynes says. It's a paradox, it's a puzzle, right? Mm-hmm. Thrift means saving. So there's this puzzle about saving behavior. And what it is what's good at the micro level, if you spend less than you make, that's good for you because you're able to save for things like retirement or an emergency or something like that. But if everyone in the economy behaves that way and closes up their wallets, puts away their checkbook, locks up their credit cards, and refuses to go out and spend because everyone's trying to save more, the economy as a whole gets clobbered, right? Because of all that lost demand. And all the government does is add to the agony if it refuses to do the replacement demand, deficit spending, and says, well, I'm going to behave just like you, right?
I think we were talking to Steve Keen in our last episode, and this might be maybe a too simplified explanation, but the funny analogy or comparison that he made was, if if a government balances budget like a household, then all households would have their own printing press
in the basement.
Well,
Like if you want to complete that analogy, fine. Yeah, there's a household budget, but
Right.
you have a printing press downstairs in
Yeah.
the basement where you can.
yeah, exactly.
You can tell
So
that.
people say, well, the government's going to end up with the debts that it can't
Right.
pay. You're going to be unable to service your debts, bondholders. So you have treasuries, right? The national debt, not going to be able to make those payments. Or you're going to have Social Security at some point in the future where you're not able to make those payments. You don't have the money. Well, right, because as you said, right, you've got a patent essentially on the US dollar. It's like a platinum patent on the dollar.
Yeah.
You have literally given yourself the exclusive right to create the currency. No one else in the world can create the US dollar legally, right? People who try go to...
If you did have that printing press in your house, you'd be in trouble.
Exactly. So we don't have that. It would be amazing if we did, because we would never have to worry again about how are we going to pay the electric bill, or how am I going to put my kids through college? It would just be cha-ching, cha-ching, right?
Nice,
But it is a fundamental difference. Having the patent on the dollar means never having to ask, how are you going to pay for it?
Well, let's push you on that then. Let's play devil's advocate, because we're often told that larger government spending will crowd out the private sector. That's like the argument, right? We're leading to less overall investment, less lower economic growth. What's wrong with that type of thinking? What does it miss about the government's unique position?
Well, let's talk about what we mean by crowding out, because normally when economists use that term, they're talking about money. They're talking about crowding out financing. So what they have in mind is, in economic jargon, it's a loanable funds theory. And what it means in simple terms is they think that money is finite, that there is some pile of savings that, people have decided not to spend some money. They put it aside. It becomes part of the savings that are available. And if you're thinking of US dollar savings, picture a pile of dollars in the world, and everybody who wants to borrow dollars to fund things beyond what they earn has to go to that pile, and they want to take a piece of it, right? So everyone's in competition for the same pile of finite, limited US dollars. So if the government wants to increase spending, but it doesn't raise taxes to offset that spending, then it's going to run a deficit. And under current law, when the government runs a deficit, it has to go out and borrow. So people think that means that the government goes into competition with everybody else who's trying to borrow dollars, and there are only so many dollars available to be loaned out. And so the additional competition drives up the price of money, which is to say the interest rate. Okay, so crowding out in economic jargon works through the bidding up of interest rates. And then the argument there is that firms will therefore borrow less because money is more expensive, right, at a higher cost. And to layer on an additional assumption, as everyone knows, government spending is far less efficient than private sector spending. So not only do you crowd out private investment, but you crowd out the more efficient, more desirable, right, better kinds of spending. You said, what's wrong with that argument? What's wrong with the argument is that they've got money completely backwards. So they're thinking of money as a finite substance. They're trapped in a gold standard world. They think that there's a pile of coins, right? That when people say you have to find the money, that question or statement conjures up an image already of something that's out there in a physical form, and it's scarce, and you have to go and get it, right? And there are other people who want it, so there's a competition for it. When in fact, modern money doesn't work like that. I don't know. You talked to Steve. You had a whole conversation, I'm sure, about endogenous money and how banks create money and all this kind of stuff. So we, as a profession, have failed. We have failed our students. We have failed policymakers. We have failed the punditry that is designed journalists who are supposed to help the public understand important issues. Economists have not stepped up and gotten this right.
Yeah, let me ask you a question about that. So you can kind of see how politicians get their advice from sort of the mainstream economic, academic community, and then the press, inevitably gets what they're covering from that sort of framework. But in your view, is it just because mainstream economists have been, educated and trained in one particular way, and they really can't see out of that framework? Or do you think, let me push you and say, do you think a lot of them sort of know that a lot of their models and the way they look at the monetary system is probably flawed? but they're so indoctrinated into this sort of framework that they're afraid to step outside. Their careers depend on it. What do you think is going on? Do you think it's a blend or a mix
Yes.
of all those things?
I do. I think it's a mix of those things, and I can say that because of personal conversations with people who have different experiences like you just described.
Yeah.
So, I have a very good friend who has been an economics professor for longer than I have.
Yeah.
And he started off teaching. When you get your first teaching job and you adopt a textbook, you're very inclined to stick with that textbook forever. As long as there's a new edition, you never
Yes,
change
yeah.
because your lecture notes always work. And
Yeah,
once
it's
you go to
great.
all the
It's the
trouble,
Bible, yeah.
Building a syllabus is a big
it's
investment.
a huge investment of time and resources. And once you get your lecture notes, from my cold dead hands, right? Am I going to ever teach this any differently or revisit this? And I too have a really good friend, and I said to him once, why do you keep teaching this stuff? Because he said to me, I read your latest article. It makes me want to change the way I'm doing. I said, well, what are you doing? He said, I'm just teaching all the, usual money and banking. I said, how can you do that? And he said, it's just so much work, It's just so much work. So I know there's that, but I also know that, and this is a completely different kind of motivation. There is something professionally risky about talking about certain things differently from the
deviating
conventional
from,
wisdom. So when I was at Cambridge, I'll name a name here because I don't care. I've told this story before. I was at Cambridge and I was taking a graduate macro theory course, and you get 15 or so professors cycling through over the course of the year. And it happened to be Willem Boyder's turn. Now, Boyder, I think, was at the Bank of England. He became chief economist at Citibank. Citibank,
Yeah.
right? This is a big name. And so Willem Boyder is the professor. He's teaching ISLM theory.
Yep.
Never mind, right? And so I'm sitting there, and I'm in this big class, and there's nothing critical at all being said about this model and so forth. And I'm sitting there kind of stewing because I was just dangerous enough. I'd read some Minsky. I'd spent time with Randy Ray. I knew where the weaknesses are, So I raised my hand, and I thought everybody in this room should know. Right? We should talk about this. So I raised my hand and I posed some question that had to do with loanable funds and money, and he turned red in the face. Not embarrassed red, angry red.
Yeah.
Like, that was not welcome. And he looked at me and he made an example of me in the class, and he pointed at me and he said, if you are the type of person who wants to talk about money and thinks that money is important, you are probably the same type of person who would enjoy beating yourself with a rubber hose.
Wow.
Now,
Mind-blowing.
he's Dutch, so it sounded better.
Yeah.
But the point is,
We can stitch the Dutch accent. I'm just
it was meant to put me in my place
Yeah.
and to tell me there are things one does not talk about.
Yes.
And this is where, again, with Steve Keen, if you're talking to Steve Keen, you must have had conversations about how insane it is
We did.
to try to do economics without talking about money and banks.
Yeah.
Yes.
As if you can have a
Yeah.
functioning monetary,
They're completely
financial
absent in their
economy.
models.
We remember the Krugman-Keen debate that was going online for
Yeah.
quite a while, and that was really
Centered around that
They're
question.
they're
Centered around
absent
that
from their
question.
models, and they want to keep it that way, right?
It's
And
just
anybody
amazing.
who tries to intrude
Yeah.
with a question or suggest, that might suggest that that's actually not to the benefit of those trying to model the real economy, are not welcome in the
Yeah.
club.
It's amazing because if you just ask a layperson, like, what does an economist do? They'll be like, oh, they're experts on money and finance, and it's
Yeah, what's really the icing on the cake of that story is that this is before the financial crisis, because
Yeah.
this was 96, 97 when I
Right.
was there. After the financial crisis, Boyder becomes one of the leading voices. I mean, he's writing all these pieces in the Financial Times and other places, trying to explain what happened, trying to explain the financial crisis.
Yeah.
This is a guy that didn't want to talk about money,
Yeah.
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 So to go back to sort of the political theater and talk and sort of lexicon around this whole fiscal responsibility, one of the most glaring contradictions when it comes to fiscal responsibility, is from self-proclaimed deficit hawks in both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, which is the insistence on, continually, as we mentioned, increase, well, let me reframe that. They continually sort of preach this thing like we need to increase defense spending versus trying to expand social programs, for example, lower income or marginalized groups, or, for example, creating universal health care or federal jobs guarantee, something along those lines. So there seems to be this sort of like cognitive dissonance going on in the minds of politicians, where there could be an enormous deficit generated from something like military spending, while there's all this talk about cutting social programs. So what do you contribute to this ability of politicians to so blatantly contradict themselves when it comes to spending? We're talking about politicians specifically here.
So, I spent some time on the Senate Budget Committee. I know the weaponry that the deficit has become, the ways in which the budgeting process becomes so politicized. And if you mentioned wanting to put more in defense, or wanting to put more in education or something else. So if you're operating, in this game where, you say, either I'm committed deficit hawk and I'm a real true believer, and there are, I think, a couple on the deficit committee who are, right? Then you say, these are my priorities. A budget reveals my priorities. And I want to put more money into infrastructure or education, the so-called discretionary component of the budget. But I also care about the impact on the deficit. I genuinely do. And so I need to offset that somewhere else. And so I go for, let's say, defense spending. That's the obvious target where Democrats often will go. They say, well, so we're going to cut defense, but we're going to do it in order to be able to put more money, devote more resources here. Others, I think, maybe less committed actually to the principle of balancing the budget, but view that same strategy as just convenient because they really want to take a whack at the defense budget because they think it's too big. We spend too much. We have too much of a militarized, and they want to reduce it so that it becomes just convenient cover to say, this is a guns and butter choice, people, and this is what principles of economics teaches you, that resources are scarce, and if you want to have more butter, things like education and infrastructure, then you have to give up some guns, and there's a trade-off here, and so.
So do you think, talking about sort of current times, do you think after we pass this big tax overhaul, all of these deficit hawks that are constantly out preaching about balancing the budget and whatnot, all lined up behind this new tax bill, are they going to now, you think, go back to their former deficit hawk sort of preaching or fear mongering in order to now like maybe cut Social Security or other social programs like that?
That's the thing. They didn't need to manufacture a so-called deficit crisis in order to go after Social Security and entitlements. That's an end goal anyway. They have two jobs. Okay, three jobs. Reduce regulation, deregulate the hell out of everything, cut taxes, and get entitlements, right? Go after entitlements. So, but they didn't need to be able to so-called blow up the deficit in order to say, oh, isn't it a shame that now we have this deficit? They were going to do that anyway. They were going to go after entitlements. So here's what happened. I was reading this morning about this retreat that's taking place with the Republicans, starting yesterday. And so they get together and they say, what should we do next? We got tax cuts. What should we do next? So Paul Ryan is reportedly talking about how you're going to go after Medicaid and some other safety net programs. And he said, but we're not going to use the deficit. Because they know that's what they think we're going to do. So, we're not going to blame it on the deficit because after all, they just did this huge tax thing.
Right? Threw that card away.
So that's what they're thinking we're going to do. So we're actually going to work on new language. And this is crazy, but this is what they do. So they'll get Luntz or somebody to come in and help them frame this whole thing, so that they can please the Koch brothers and others, and they can deliver on the next part of the agenda, which is, gutting entitlements. So they're figuring out how can we sell this to the public in a way that doesn't involve, we have to do this because of what we just did to the deficit. So we have to call it, we're not going to call it workfare. So they're playing with the language. And they're saying, how can we label this thing so that it sounds like kinder, gentler, we're doing it for your own good kind of thing. We're just trying to help you,
Which is amazing, because now instead of making an example out of that, there's a lot of Democrats who are now, playing the role of the deficit hawk and kind of saying, this new tax bill is going to add, whatever it is, $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion.
Yeah, but that's in the past. Look, they grabbed at everything they could find in order to oppose that. Now, I don't think they spend as much time talking about the impact on inequality.
Should have been inequality.
I think that they definitely played the deficit card far more often. But the Republicans are not done yet. I don't think they're done adding to the deficit. They're talking about infrastructure now. And the Democrats aren't saying we can't spend any more money because of the deficit. They're saying if you're going to put more in defense, which they're also, by the way, saying we want to do more defense spending, Democrats are saying, parity, don't forget, every dollar of additional spending that goes to defense, we have a thing, right? Yeah. This has been our deal. We've been doing $1 of defense and $1 of non-defense discretionary type spending. So Democrats are saying, if you're going to spend more, you got to spend more on the stuff we want too.
It's amazing.
Going back to Paul Ryan, and the Republican Party at large, kind of the use of language, you had a really great moment in one of your presentations where you took a snippet of Paul Ryan speaking to Alan Greenspan and trying to push the privatization of Social Security. I think he used, again, it's probably pulled language, right?
Personal retirement accounts.
Yeah, personal retirement accounts. Can you explain Greenspan's response to that and kind of how it relates back to what we're talking about right now?
I can. Your listeners should Google Greenspan and Paul Ryan on Social Security and watch it. It's so great. I show this to audiences every time I give a talk.
When I heard it was big grin.
And what's funny is Paul Ryan asks one question, and it's actually, if you pay attention, it's one sentence, but it goes on forever. And he uses the phrase personal retirement accounts 4 times when he's asking the question. Yeah. Now, this is under oath. Alan Greenspan is sitting there. This is back when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve. So he's sitting there under oath. And Paul Ryan is asking a question. He says, look, don't you agree with me that now is the time to begin to move toward a system of personal retirement accounts? Because as we all know, Social Security is going broke, and so we have to do things today. Don't you think personal retirement accounts can be a way of securing with personal retirement? It's just like, come on, right?
Get to the point.
I have teed this question up for you. All you have to do is say yes. That's the answer I'm looking for. Just say yes. And to his great surprise and dismay, Alan Greenspan did not just say yes. He actually told the truth. He leans into the microphone and he says, well, I wouldn't say that Social Security is insecure. The benefits are insecure the way they're set up today. There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. And at this point, this is the best part of the video because Ryan, you just see all the color drain from his face. He cannot believe now what's happened, right? The genie's out of the bottle. There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. What did Greenspan do? He took the affordability question off the table. He said, we can talk about Social Security. We can talk about the challenges ahead, but we can't talk about it in the context of we can't make the payments because we can always make the payments. So what was Greenspan's point? And this is what's really important. If we were actually having this debate in this country, it would be so important and so fascinating to have everybody weighing in to try to solve this problem. And so what Greenspan goes on to say is, the question is, how do you set up a system which assures that the real assets are created, which those benefits are employed to purchase? What does that mean in everyday language? It means, how do you make sure that the U.S. economy is going to be productive enough in 5, 10, 20, 30 years so that when we make payments to future retirees, their dependents, and the disabled, that when the checks show up in the mail or the digital entries show up in your bank account, that you can turn around and spend that money into an economy and there's stuff to buy. Because what Greenspan is doing is focusing on the fact that demographics in this country are changing. The boomers are moving out of the workforce and into retirement. So they're making stuff today, they're producing, but soon they'll be consuming and not producing. So how do we figure out how to deal with a situation where we're going to have fewer people left behind working and producing stuff, but all of these retirees are still going to want to consume stuff? And it's not a problem as long as you have a productive economy. So what are the investments that we should be making today, knowing that this is the challenge of the future, that will make sure that the U.S. economy is as productive as it can be in 10, 20, 30 years? I would say R&D, infrastructure, education. We know what the things are that increase long-term productivity and long-term prosperity. We're just doing all the wrong stuff.
You just had a New York Times article in the op-ed section recently. Can you talk a little bit about how community health centers and healthcare, investing in healthcare, adds to long-term productivity and actual growth?
Yeah, I think so. That piece came out just a couple of days ago, I think. And it was in response to the State of the Union. And so I just chose to take the infrastructure piece because, what people heard Donald Trump say in the State of the Union was 1.5 trillion in infrastructure. That's what people heard. Okay, what does
that look like, right?
What does he really mean? What do the Republicans really mean? They're talking about, we know this from, I guess, a leaked document that lays out a sort of blueprint for the way that they're thinking about infrastructure investment. They're thinking about around $200 billion of public money, right? Government funding. So out of 1.5 trillion, 200 billion in actual government spending. So where does the rest of it come from? Some of it, the expectation is that state and local governments are going to pony up. Well, good luck, right? Especially with what's happened with the tax bill in terms of, high tax states and so forth. And so, that's a problem. But anyway, a lot of it is going to be private financing. That's what they have in mind. So private equity and other investors who are supposed to come in and fund large-scale infrastructure investments. Anyway, and we could talk about what the problems with that are. But you asked about my op-ed. And so I said, well, why don't we think about community health centers? We have community health centers all over this country. We could have a huge build out, and that's infrastructure investment. We build hospitals and schools, that's infrastructure. You build community health centers as part of the infrastructure spending. And why would that be important? Well, you could make community health centers free and accessible to everyone in America. So I cited some work done by a woman who's a friend of mine, who's a former ER doctor. She does a lot of work in this area. She has a proposal with these community health centers at the center of the proposal here. And so what she says is, look, at any point in time, 75% of the population only needs primary care. And so what you want to do, everybody talks about the high cost of health care, but none of the proposals that are bandied about really get at cost. And she's saying, take primary care out of insurance. It doesn't belong there. You insure things that are high cost or rare events. Primary care is stuff we all need. They don't meet the usual criteria for why you buy insurance for something. So make these things, and she says, make them like Starbucks. They're everywhere. And they're of a certain high quality. They're nice, and they're facilities that you can walk in. No, there's no billing, there are no co-pays, everybody gets a card, everybody has access to these, and they're free and they're everywhere, and it deals with primary care. And she's saying add dental, add mental care. And so I'm thinking about this, and I'm listening to the president's speech, and I think, well, what if we did, as part of infrastructure, this huge build out of community health centers, and then we also address things like the opioid epidemic, because these can be centers for care for people who are dealing with, addiction and that sort of a thing. And so that's what I was thinking.
I encourage everyone listening to check it out.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm going to kind of change directions a little bit, but you have a new report that just came out called The Macroeconomic Effects of Student Debt Cancellation, which was published through the Levy Institute. And it makes a pretty powerful case that canceling student debt would give the economy quite an economic stimulus. Can you take us a bit through the general questions that the report set out to answer and some general findings? And then also I have another follow-up question here, which is, and maybe you can get to it in your answer, but the interesting way that the student loans themselves are distributed between private and public accounts where it really wouldn't be spending more in this cancellation since the government holds or already has spent some of this money. So yeah, just take us through that report, some interesting points, at least some of the main points.
Sure. So this is a report that I'm not the sole author on this report. There's a co-authored report. Yep. One of my former colleagues at UMKC, Catherine Rushlin, Marshall Steinbaum, who is at the Roosevelt Institute, and Scott Fulweiler. And Scott did the heavy lifting in terms of this report. All of the accounting, the really detailed questions about how do you actually go about canceling student loan debt. I mean, we're talking about removing things from balance sheets, right? And they exist all over the place. So how do you actually do it? What are the mechanics of eliminating or canceling student loan debt? So what the report did was ask a simple hypothetical. Okay, what would happen if it all just went away? And so we were approached with this question by a couple who they both are graduates of UC Berkeley. They have done very well for themselves, and they're looking at this problem and they're saying, my God, 44 million Americans are trapped with student loan debt.
Is that what, 1.4 or 1.5 million?
It's about
trillion,
right.
Yeah, sorry, right?
$1.4 trillion. So there's more student loan debt than there is credit card debt.
It's amazing.
Right? It's the second largest component next to home mortgages.
Just among this table, I think we have how much in
about
student
close to
debt
150.
together?
Yeah, you're looking at like a sizable house standing in front of you.
We have a vested interest.
But,
So, like I said, they went to Berkeley, and they went to Berkeley at a time when it was essentially free to go to Berkeley. And they're saying, this is just tragic. What's happened to all this generation of young people? And, what would happen if we just somehow found a way to make it so they didn't have to pay it back, right? And they could start their lives and so forth. So they came to us with this proposition, this question. Could you look at this as economists, and could you do some sort of macro analysis and tell us what would be the economic impact of doing this? So I said, yeah, we could do that. I assembled a team. They had Mark Zandi of Moody's agree to allow us to use the Zandi model to do some of the simulations. So we put the data in, and then the Zandi model does some forecasting for us. We did that, and we also used it's called the FAIR model. So that way we would have the analysis run through two different models. So it would be sort of the findings would be robust. And, basically it does what any reasonable person would expect it to do. So if you told people who on average have about $30,000 in student loan debt, you don't have to pay that back. And what happens? Automatically it comes off of your balance sheet. So if you think of a liability, a big liability disappearing, what happens? Your net worth goes up by the same amount. So now you've just become wealthier, right, on paper. You have increased your wealth. And what else happens? Every month, instead of pulling out your checkbook and writing that $500 and whatever dollar check to service your student loan debt, you can do something else with that $500, right? What would you do? Maybe you'd eat out a few more times. Maybe you would make other purchases, buy other things with that money. Maybe you'd pay down some other debt, maybe you'd save a little bit, but I'll bet you'd spend an awful lot of that money. You'd find other ways to spend that money. And so
maybe you'd move out of your house.
Yeah, maybe you'd move out of your parents'
basement. Wait, no, I'm sorry.
basement.
Millennials just like to live in the basement of their parents' house.
Right.
It's not that we're sitting on piles of cash in that basement.
Maybe, you are a young couple. Maybe you're not like so many people who are struggling with student loan debt, and you think, I can't get married yet because we can't afford the wedding, and we can't afford the house. So you put off starting your life, you put off starting a family. Maybe you have one child, but it's all you can do to deal with the expenses associated with childcare and raising a child. So you say, we want to have another baby, we can't afford it. We have the student loan debt, we have all this. So you can imagine all of those things. I'd love to start a business, but I can't get a loan because I have all this student loan debt. I can't. So what we found is that, it would do about what you would expect it to do. You'd get a boost because you have a wealth effect and an income effect. And both of those things working together provide a stimulus to the economy. So it works almost like a tax cut because it frees up disposable income.
Right.
But it works as a good kind of tax cut because it's targeted at the right people, right?
Yeah.
We're not targeting the people in the top 1%. They didn't take on student loan debt. You're targeting, everybody else. And so what the report shows is that a lot of good stuff happens and nothing bad happens. That's the simple way to put it. What would happen if it were inflationary, if it drove up interest rates because the Fed had to react to all this additional inflation? Then you'd say this may not be a good idea, right?
Yeah.
But the models tell us that that's not what happens. What you get is an increase in real economic activity, unemployment goes down, growth goes up, inflation is modestly impacted, very small increase. And by the way, the Fed's been trying to get inflation up, so they might actually say thank you.
Hear about it every day.
And then again, I mean, just to circle back to it too, what was so striking to me was the point that any student loan debt that's held currently by the government, right? It's really not a cost.
Yeah,
just
right.
what they make in interest.
Exactly. No, you got
line that out,
you
please.
got that exactly right. I skipped that part of your question. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
So yeah, the thing is that almost all of the 1.4 trillion in outstanding student loan debt is already on the government's books. And so it turns out that it's much easier to dispose of that piece of it because the government just says, you know what? Don't send any more money, right?
Yeah.
You're not paying this back. You have a bit that is privately issued and some of it that's private but government backed. That's small by comparison. So you're looking at around 1.2 trillion of the
Vast
total.
majority,
That's already on the government's books. So you're just dealing with the other piece of it. And then the government figures out whether it wants to service those loans, take over the payments essentially, or
For the private ones you're talking about.
or just buy them and cancel them.
Yeah. And then the government is setting up new programs, contracting private debt collectors to collect these student loans. So it seems like it's just this tautology of logic that
They can fire the debt collectors.
Exactly.
They'll save
There
a
you
little
go.
money.
Save some money. So we talked to Steve Keen back in January. This is going to go back to this question of a debt jubilee, and he said. We talked to Steve Keen back in January about some of these issues surrounding things like the monetary system, how money is created, and the impact of private debt on financial instability. One of his propositions was a kind of QE for the people, like we just talked about, for students. Instead of injecting these large sums of money into the financial institutions that essentially went into assets and did little or nothing for the real economy, perhaps debt forgiveness and fiscal stimuli into areas of the economy where working people are most affected would provide this kind of boost politicians and economists constantly expound that they want. What are your thoughts on this larger kind of debt jubilee, and how could that play out in practical terms?
Well, I have to know exactly a little bit more specific what we're talking about. I mean, I just basically described for you a form of, if you want to call it, people's QE, because in the paper we go through two ways to do that. And one way would be for the Fed to buy the loans. Okay, so that I think that would qualify as, what these people are describing as people's QE, have the Fed buy it and then forgive it. So I'm sympathetic to the idea because we just wrote it up in the paper. And I think it fits.
So you think that could apply
I think it
on
fits
a
the
larger
description.
scale? Because his point too was obviously, as I think you would agree with, high private debt levels, make economies ripe for financial crises. So it's not only just like the moral thing to do, but it's also kind of like the fiscally responsible thing to do.
Yeah, but here's the other way to go about it, right? And I think that maybe politically going after debt of a variety of types.
Yeah.
I think the reason it works with student loan debt is because you can associate the policy decision with a specific policy failure, which is, look, it used to be free. You didn't have to pay to go to public colleges and universities. It was free. It's going to be free again. Tennessee, New York, half the states are already moving in that direction. It's these people who got trapped in the middle of history, where they had the misfortune, right? They had the misfortune of being bookended by governments that got it right, and they got trapped in the middle. And because they got trapped in the middle, and they went to school at a time when we failed as policymakers to make provide the funding. So I get that you can say, because we did that, to
Right.
these people. We're going to fix it. Okay, we created this problem. Now, I don't know that you can persuade me that we can talk about, debt jubilees of a variety of kinds in the same way. I think, for me, it just works better to say we're going to push people's incomes up so that they can get rid of the debt, and then we're going to restructure the economy in a way that people don't actually have to take on debt in order to meet, the obligations that people normally have to take on, health care and child care and college and all those things. This is why people get, driven into debt. So I would probably be more inclined to say, let's do things that raise and push up incomes, and then let's restructure the economy in ways that take the burden off of people for retirement, for health care, for housing. We have to do a lot of things in a lot of different markets.
I think about a fifth of mortgages are held at the Fed too, right? So, yeah.
So we obviously talked about this earlier, but I think it's really important just to drive the point home for some of the folks listening. What exactly is the logic behind, I kind of wanted to get into specific sort of policy areas, right? We saw through the Bernie campaign that a lot of people were encouraged in fighting for stuff like universal health care, free public higher education. So what's the logic behind that, like, we or the government simply cannot fund programs like that? So another way to ask it is a lot of our listeners, or a good portion of them, are progressive activists, organizers, people working on a variety of economic and social justice movements and issues. And some may be sitting here listening to you, and they might say, like, wait a minute, now that I know all of this, like, what the hell have I been arguing for, for the past few years? Because you realize that once you start from that premise or paradigm of debating, like, how much do you need to pay for things like universal health care, et cetera, as we've seen, in most cases, you're going to lose that,
big numbers,
that argument. Right? So I know you're an economist, but what do you think, for people trying to work towards pushing these policies, what do you think is the political messaging, maybe not so much about strategy, but maybe political strategy, if you will, to get this framework out to people in a palatable, accessible way? And what's the best way to start injecting this into our political discussion and start demanding of our policymakers and politicians to understand this as well?
It's such a big question,
Yeah.
and I don't know if this is your last question, but if it is, this is the question to end on. This is the biggest question. I'll try to take it piece by piece. I'm working on 2 books at the moment. Both are aimed at popular audiences, and both, I hope, will empower people like the kinds of people that you've just described. I mean, it's not a book written for policymakers, but it's a book designed to change the policy narrative. It's not a book written for activists, but it's a book designed to empower activists in these conversations. And so I'm doing things through that channel to try to be of use. But, if you're talking about people pushing, and so you've got the Fight for 15 movement, or you have, any number of things, activists surrounding protecting Social Security. How should they approach policymakers? How should they argue for resources?
Right.
Is that kind of, in this, because education, there is this belief that it's a zero-sum game. And the only way that I get more money, that I persuade policymakers to put more money in my agenda area, is by showing them that there's some other less worthy thing, right? And so what you often hear, at least this is my experience, is organizations coming in and arguing for resources and tearing down somebody else as the pay for, and so one of the things, first step is recognizing that the federal government, this is policy, this is politics. It's a political choice. It is, do you have the political will to fund this? But that the government cannot fund everything, and it cannot fund every request at the level that's being asked. Why? It's not because they can't come up with the money to do it. We know that's not the reason. The reason is that the economy has its own constraints, its own kind of internal speed limit. And if you just start willy-nilly writing checks, saying, oh, you can have money for this and you can have money for this, and then groups start spending into the economy, you will get an inflation problem. So there has to be some budgeting mechanism that provides discipline. That's important.
Well, just to jump in there, because we have a few more questions, but we want to give you some time. What are the limits to government spending? You just mentioned inflation. I think you had people, just to reference Paul Krugman again, I think we talked about him. I'm not sure where he kind of came out, and I'm not sure if he switched his position on it since then. Basically said, as per like the MMTers, this sort of level of government spending could create, high inflation or like potentially hyperinflationary situations.
So look, you have a government with a fiat currency. And as Alan Greenspan said, there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. That's not Kelton. That's not MMT. That's Alan Greenspan for crying out loud.
Right.
So they already know this. Okay? They already know this. The limits are in the real economy. They're not in the pile of cash that sits in the world. But that's not how the world works. Modern money is created by fiat. Okay, so what are the limits? The limits are in the real economy. So right now, if Donald Trump says, let's do 1.5 trillion in infrastructure. Let's do it over the next 3 years. My first question is, not how are you going to pay for it? My first question is, how do you know 1.5 trillion is an appropriate number to spend into the U.S. economy over the next 3 years on infrastructure? Have you bothered to look to find out whether we have the labor that can be mobilized? So do we have people with skills in construction? Do we have engineers? Do we have architects? Do we have the necessary skill, the machinery, stuff to move, heavy stuff and dig and drill and build and cranes? Do we have the capital? Do we have the capacity? Does the U.S. economy have the capacity to absorb 1.3 trillion in infrastructure investment over the next 3 years? Do we have the slack? Do we have the resources? These are the questions that matter, not, where will we find the money and can we spend it in? So if he said, let's do 1.5 trillion in infrastructure and let's also do these tax cuts and let's also do, and you start putting together a huge ambitious fiscal agenda and you haven't bothered to figure out whether, the economy can handle all of that at once, you're going to get an inflation problem.
So I just want to drill down here because that word inflation, it's written in all financial material, or if anyone picks up any newspaper or is interested at all in the economy or not, right? You're going to see that word. Can you give us the simplest illustration of how inflation occurs and what it is? I can still remember in my first class, it was very simple put, was that it's when too many dollars are chasing not enough goods. And for me, that kind of was an insight, obviously much more complicated than that, but it really allowed me to wrap my head around this term that seems to carry a lot of baggage. Could you give inflation?
It's actually a whole lot more complicated than that makes it sound.
Absolutely.
Right? So, but that is the quick and dirty definition. That's the sort of Milton Friedman, Chicago school definition. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That's what Friedman said. And that meant that, prices go up when you have too many people with too much money looking to spend it and not enough goods available. Too much money chasing too few goods. That's how lots of people describe inflation. Turns out inflation is much more complicated. We don't measure the prices of all the goods in the economy. We kind of put together a basket
milk,
that's
gasoline,
supposed to represent. And then we change the weights periodically, and we do things like imputing rental prices, and so it gets health care, transportation. It's and market power and monopoly. All of those things, right? Feed into this. So it's not even clear, really, that doing large-scale in infrastructure investment, tax cuts, and those things would generate inflation, because it is so dependent on contributions in these areas like healthcare and transportation and housing and so forth. So it's complicated.
Oh, very nice. Well, I wanted to also ask you a listener question who actually called in to our Google Voice and left a message. So let me just play that for you really quick right now, and you can answer it.
Please talk about how politicians and economists could explain, especially politicians, to the public about taxes? Thank you.
That call was from one of our listeners, R.L. Jamin. They also wrote in to kind of clean up that question, maybe make it a little bit more nuanced, and this is what they wrote. Many on the left are inclined to believe that tax cuts are fundamentally problematic, conceptualizing them as compromising our ability for the federal government to fund spending. So with that being said, are all tax cuts bad? And what constitutes an appropriate tax cut, in your opinion? So, Professor Kelton, can you answer those?
Thank you for that question. So I do think that this is a really important question, because I do think that Democrats have allowed themselves to be painted by Republicans as the tax and spend party. So that Republicans are able to go out there and say, all the Democrats want to do is raise your taxes. Because, I mean, let's be honest, you don't hear a lot of Democrats putting forward legislation to cut taxes. It is sort of mostly associated with Republicans, but people actually like to have their taxes cut. So, the question is, are there good kinds of tax cuts? And, Democrats obviously did not like the tax cuts that just came down. No Democrat voted for them in either the House or the Senate. That was tremendous. So there was something they said, we're not voting for these. Now, is it because Democrats just refused to vote for tax cuts? I don't think so. Most Democrats said that the reason they were objecting is because of the way these tax cuts were structured. So if 83% of the benefits, or 84%, I forgot the exact number, go to people in top 1%, then these are tax cuts for them. They're not tax cuts for everyone. And if you want to talk about tax cuts, let's come and sit down at the table and we'll talk about putting together a tax plan that we can get behind. But we want to help the people who need it most, not the people who need it the least. So the question, are there tax cuts that would be good tax cuts? And the answer is yes. And when would you want to do that? So all a tax cut does is raise somebody's disposable income. You just allow people to hold more, to keep more income, right? So why would you want to do that? Well, one reason would be you might want to affect the distribution of income. Perfectly reasonable thing to do in an economy in which we're looking at 1920 style discrepancies between the distribution of income from those at the top and everybody else. So using the tax system to impact things like the distribution of income, one perfectly reasonable thing to do. What about just using it as a form of stimulus? I mean, fiscal policy, we tend to think about it as government spending, but that's not what fiscal policy is. Fiscal policy is the two pieces of that. It's the G and the T. It's government spending and taxes. So if you don't want to pull back on the spending lever, then you can push forward or pull back, whatever, on the tax lever. So no reason that anyone should be opposed to thinking about taxes and changes in taxes as a way of achieving broad macroeconomic goals like higher employment, higher output. Those are perfectly reasonable thing to do. You just have to target the tax cuts to those who are likely to turn around and spend the money into the economy so that you get the desired outcome.
Yeah, there's that term that economists use, marginal propensity to consume.
There is that term.
And that's a very class-laden term if you think about empirical reality and who spends more. It's working and middle-class people. So effective demand would essentially come from a tax cut for those people instead of a tax cut for the 1%.
Like half the income distribution, half the population has essentially nothing set aside apart from what's been done for them in Social Security, nothing saved for retirement. So they spend, in other words, they spend everything they get. And
more in some cases, right? If you're borrowing
and more. So so aiming tax cuts at people with, as you said, a higher propensity to spend out of the windfall is exactly how you generate the kind of boost to the economy that Trump is talking about. The way that they've structured this thing, and they're talking about, he says 4, 5, 6% growth. Well, you know what?
It's amazing that he's saying that. It's like,
I mean, we might be looking at first quarter growth 2018 that's around 5%. It's tracking right now. We could see a number like that come in. It could happen. And keep in mind, even though Democrats keep saying that these tax cuts, that these are tax increases on the majority of the population, they're not tax increases unless and until the tax cuts expire. So for a number of years, for the next 7 years or so, people in every decile of the income distribution, whether you're in the bottom 10th or the top 10th or anywhere in between, on average, you are going to see some increase in your take-home pay as a result of these tax cuts. They're going to impact you. And you have to expect that that's going to show up as a boost to the economy. Now, the question is, will they shoot themselves in the foot by cutting other programs and doing things that raise healthcare premiums so that, yes, you get a little bit of additional take-home pay because of the tax cuts, but then your healthcare premiums, shoot up, and so you're worse off. So
in the near term,
it's a question of what they'll do going forward with policy, but, it's going to, quote, work for an awful lot of people for a period of time.
Yes. One of the questions we need to ask you, since you're a prominent female economist, I think it's something like only 13% of U.S. Academic economists are women, and only one has won the Nobel Prize for economics.
I accept.
You want to reward you? We'll try to help nominate you in this podcast. What kind of difficulties do women face in the economics profession? And what kind of experiences can you share or would like to share for the young woman either trying to break into the economics profession or just starting out in it?
I remember being at a conference, 95, I think, an economics conference in Denver, and somebody took a photograph. And after the conference, they sent me a copy of the picture. And I was looking at this picture, and somebody else came over and said, "Are you always the only female at these things?" And it was the first time it ever occurred to me. And that's crazy, because here I am surrounded by all of these
Did you have a lot of brothers, or?
I have no brothers.
Oh, okay.
It just didn't occur to me, honestly. And I looked at the picture, and then I had to answer the question, and so I had to think about it. And I started picturing myself in different settings, and I said, yeah, I guess I am. But it honestly had not occurred to me. Now, I was young, and I'm certainly more in tune with those disparities today. But teaching graduate classes, at least at my previous university, the balance was very close to even, maybe 40, 60, something like that. We had a lot of women in our graduate program, and we worked in part to make that the case as well. We wanted the representation. I see there is an imbalance, no question about it. I think, I would encourage women. I think a lot of women see it as a male profession. Being an economist is something men do, especially old white-haired men. White men, yeah. But women are entering the discipline, and I'm seeing more and more come up and come through and succeed. And it's still harder for women through the promotion and tenure process. Women do have more difficulties, no question about it, getting from assistant to associate professor and then making the final jump.
There's one woman I kind of forgot. She was saying, like, if you're published if you're co-authored on a paper with a male, it'll be like the male that receives the sort of the accolades or the attention for the promotion or whatever it might be.
I'm not familiar with all of that literature, but I know that it's out there, and I know that there are people who look at this sort of stuff. And this never occurred to me to think of in all these years, but my very first publication in a peer-reviewed journal was in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, which is a pretty good journal. And I remember that I published it as S.A. Bell. And I did it because I didn't want people to know that it was by a female. Because you know why? I thought fewer people would read it.
That's a great story to have on.
It's amazing.
I'm sure.
It seems very typical too.
Yeah. So shout out to John Jay College, because we have half of our class is women, so we're doing a good job.
That's right. There you go. So last question we need to ask you. You were economic advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders during his 2016 bid for president. What do you think, Bernie 2020?
I hear a lot of people are really hoping that that's the case. Look, it's an important voice. No question about it. His is an important voice. He continues to raise issues that don't get raised without his voice. I don't know what he's going to do, but I can tell you that in my time working with him in the Senate, to describe him as tireless is not to do justice. I couldn't keep up with him. It is incredible.
Well, Professor Stephanie Kelton, thank you for joining us on Left Out.
We appreciate it.
Thanks for coming by. It was fun.
Yeah,
Of course,
absolutely.
absolutely. So thank you for joining us on another episode of Left Out. We hope you really enjoyed this episode. A really special thanks, of course, to Professor Stephanie Kelton for sitting down and spending her time so graciously with us and teaching us all about these really important issues. Thank you as well, of course, to Corey Morgart, our audio engineer. Thank you to Tito Valentine for our new introductory music that you hear.
Some cool tunes.
Some cool tunes.
And make sure you guys hit us up on Patreon with a few dollars. We're also newly on Twitter at Left Out Podcast. And any of the studies or reports that we mentioned in the episode, we'll make sure to plug those and put the links in the show description.
And finally, a special thanks to Democracy at Work for hosting this podcast on their channels.
This was Left Out.